Well, welcome to episode 173 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Rush's debut album, Rush. What I have here is a 1978 reissue on Anthem Records, which of course is Rush's own label. What to expect from this record? Well, a lot of people say, oh, this is the record where Rush starts out trying to be like Led Zeppelin on their debut before they abandon it and find the religion of prog rock. I really disagree. And actually, you'll find that view even on like Rush fans' wikis and so on, which people ought to know better. I do hear a connection or mimicry or some kind of reflection of another band's sound. It's much, much more like the Sabbath sound than it is like Zeppelin's sound. But whatever the similarities are, this record is clearly the most kind of blues rock oriented and mainstream classic rock sounding album they produced, certainly in the 1970s. So Alex Lifeson is born in Fernie, BC, of all places, a beautiful, idyllic ski town where most of Canada's national ski team at various points seems to come from. Anyway, he moved there because his parents were Yugoslavian Serbs who had immigrated to Canada in the late 40s, early 1950s. He's born in Fernie. The family's name, of course, is not actually Lifeson, it's Zivjinovic. And he eventually, as a stage name, will anglicize that name because apparently in Serbian that means son of life, so he becomes Lifeson as a stage name. Anyway, family moves to Toronto and young Alex gets immersed in music lessons, originally classical music, but eventually moving to the guitar. He meets John Rutsey, who's a drummer on this record, when they're both 10 years old in Toronto at school. And eventually they'd go on when they were teenagers to form a band called The Projection, which lasts in various guises until 1968 when it breaks up for good. After that band breaks up, Lifeson and Rutsey decide they want to keep playing together, so they form another band, this time a trio, and they bring in a guy on bass and vocals, not Geddy Lee, they bring in a guy called Jeff Jones. Jones, who actually goes on to have a career of some significance actually with a band called The Ocean, who had that great hit in 1971, Put Your Hand in the Hand, and he was also with Tom Cochrane and Red Rider, and he's the guy who plays bass on Lunatic Fringe, of all things. Anyway, he only lasts one gig because he had other musical interests and he didn't think this band was going to go anywhere, so off he goes. As it turns out, Alex had another friend who kind of fit the bill, a guy called Gary Lee Weinrib, who he'd met on the very first day of junior high school. Gary, of course, didn't go by Gary, he went by Geddy, and the story behind that is kind of funny because his mom, who had a very thick East European Jewish accent, when she was calling him in for dinner, would shout out, Geddy, Geddy, Geddy. And his friends would say, I thought your name was Gary. He says, yeah, well, it's just the way my mom pronounces it. Anyway, it ends up sticking. So he's Geddy to his friends. And then when he's 16, he ends up changing his name legally and permanently. There were various lineup changes, including at one point Geddy getting punted, which seems kind of bizarre. But anyway, that lasted apparently one gig and the replacement was a disaster. By mid-1971, the lineup has settled. It's John Rutsey on drums, Geddy Lee on bass and vocals, and Alex Lifeson on guitar. They've got a guy called Ray Daniels with two N's, who's their manager, who's a contemporary of theirs, about the same age, and he had a business partner, a guy called Vic Wilson, and together the two of them managed the band's affairs. They can't get a deal for love or money, thanks to the kind of self-defeating and self-debasing nature of the Canadian record industry in the early 1970s. So with their manager's help, they end up forming their own record label called Moon Records, and it is Moon Records who puts out their very first releases. In early 73, they go into Eastern Sound Studios in Toronto, working with producer Dave Stock, and they produce their very first single. The A-side is a Buddy Holly cover, Not Fade Away, which the Stones, of course, have done some degree of success in the mid-1960s. It made basically no real dent in the charts. So they're pretty frustrated. They keep gigging, and they're looking for another opportunity. That opportunity comes along later in 1973 thanks to their management team, who were great hustlers, who get them a spot opening up for the New York Dolls when the New York Dolls come to Toronto. What happens at that gig is Rush actually blows them off the stage because they were far more proficient players, far tighter as a band. And after that gig, they realized, we could really do this. We're aiming too low. We have to cut an album. We got to go for it. We got to tour. We have to make our name. So in early 1974, they go back into the studio. They don't go back to where they'd been before, Eastern Sound Studios, working with Dave Stock. Instead, they go to Toronto Sound Studios and they start to work for the very first time with a guy called Terry Brown, who was the owner. They love the relationship with him, and within 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 days, they've cut the rest of the tracks, they've remixed the whole album, and this album is ready to go. It's released in March 1974. It rocks very much in a March 1974 kind of way. There's way more cowbell on this record than maybe all other Rush records combined. I haven't actually done a cowbell count, Rush fans, so don't call me out on that one. At the start, of course, when it's released, it doesn't make much headway until, famously, there's a woman at an FM radio station in Cleveland who is flipping through new releases and picks up one of the 3,000 copies of this album, which were originally released with the red label, not with the pink label, and puts it on, and the song she picks is Working Man, which ends up becoming a big sleeper underground hit in Cleveland. People are phoning saying, this is great. The radio station relays the information about what a big hit this is to the band's management. There's all kinds of connections made. There's connections made to Mercury Records, who signed these guys for 200 grand, which was a pretty, and 3 albums, I think, is a deal, which is a pretty big deal, actually, for an unknown band in 1974. Problem, of course, is that John Rutsey, the drummer, who had been really, in fairness, the leader of this band, he was big into bands like Bad Company, whereas Lee and Lifeson, unsurprisingly, were big into prog rock bands. They loved Yes, they loved Pink Floyd. This was the tension in the band. So there's one issue, and that probably would have led to a split at some point in the next year or two anyway. But the other issue, of course, was Rutsey's health. He was a diabetic, and he didn't manage it well, and it was pretty clear to everybody that he was not going to be able to prosper, perhaps even survive the rigors of, for instance, a year-long tour all the way through the States. And in the end, Lee and Lifeson, backed by band management, fire Rutsey and end up bringing in Neil Peart, who, of course, in his own way, fundamentally alters the trajectory of the band, both through his own more literary and fantastical lyrical constructions, but also freeing up Lee and Lifeson to pursue the more prog orientation they've been itching to try. The album starts with Finding My Way, which begins with some building distorted guitar out of the left channel, a very kind of an AC/DC feel actually at the time, leaving you really no doubt as to what's to follow. You're going to have your hair blown back, and you absolutely do. Alex's solo work is really quite distinctive here. It's kind of this halfway house between rhythm and lead. If you're in a power trio, it requires a lot of the string players. Well, it requires a lot of everybody, really. And he really rises to the challenge, and you can tell, even just from this very first song, how adept he is at bridging those two different roles. Need Some Love is a short little song, a little over 2 minutes. Bit of an elegy to the desires and wants of youth. It's another real winner of a song. And it's followed up by Take a Friend, which has this great, almost Sabbath-worthy riff. Alex's tone is just delicious, and Rutsey, I think, too, in this song, acquits himself really well. There's a lot of reasons why Rutsey might have been evicted from this band, but being a bad drummer clearly is not one of them. Here Again, which is actually the longest song on the album, is the song which closes out side one. Rutsey's drumming on the song, I think, is quite unusual. It's quite upbeat. You can imagine this song being played with maybe even half as many notes by the drummer as you actually get. And I'm not sure whether what he does is good or bad. It certainly marks this song out as different from something like Since I've Been Loving You by Zeppelin or Freebird by Skynyrd, which are both kind of similar in structure, but have a very, very different feel, largely because of the approach of the percussion. Side 2 starts with What You're Doing. This isn't quite up to the standards, I don't think, of the first side. I don't think it's up to the standard lyrically. It's got that kind of, don't tell us to stop rocking, mister, kind of attitude, or more musically, but I would say that Alex's solo here is really pretty good. The next song is In the Mood, which is the very first Rush song that I ever heard because it was anthologized on, and people outside of Canada, maybe the States, I don't know, may not get this reference, but there was an outfit called K-Tel in the 70s. He used to put out albums which were compilations, and they'd put like 30 songs on one LP. They'd get the groove so narrow and put 50 songs on a side. They'd edit them down so they would fit. Anyway, this song was on Canada Gold, the K-Tel release in 1974. It had lyrical themes of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and it's a perfect little pop song. Before and After is next. This is kind of ballady at first, but then it balls out again. And this is a pretty respectable rocker. It's not really the top of their pile of achievements, but it's not bad. Solid album track. The last song is Working Man. It's got a Sabbathy intro. It's got these blue-collar lyrics, which really resonated with the good people of Cleveland. And it has this instrumental break, which could absolutely have been an outtake from the first Sabbath album, those extended jams on that first record. Not just Alex's playing, but his tone as well. It's almost indistinguishable from Iommi. Rush fans, I'm led to believe, differ in their appraisal of this record. For a lot of people, this is kind of a way station on the journey to the real Rush. Well, maybe. For me personally, I prefer hard rock to prog. The more that Rush rocks out, the more I like them. And this album really rocks pretty hard. It also has that curiosity factor. For me, it's easily in their top 7 or 8 records. It's an essential piece of hard rock history, and I think it's really one to investigate for rock fans who are maybe less keen on prog rock than some of Rush's more hardcore fan base. And I give it 4 out of 5 stars.